So as we continue our discussion on compensating wage differentials, I'd like to take a few minutes and discuss this from the employee standpoint, or look at employee considerations. If we think about this, we know that employees gain utility or benefit from wages, from, say, retirement plans, health insurance, vacation, sick leave, maybe other perks of the job, from working hours and the demands that are placed upon them. Sometimes this is going to give possible positive versus negative utility. A lower wage will give less utility than a higher wage. Better working hours and better productivity demands will give more utility to a worker perhaps than those that are different than that. Working conditions. We can easily think about this in terms of safety, in terms of the physical surroundings. Do I like being a place with lots of light and windows and coworkers that I enjoy and that's safe? Or do I like being in a place where I'm confined and constrained, where it's just me, I'm allowed to do my work, be left alone, I don't care about light, I don't care about conversing with other employees. And so these different conditions might yield different levels of utility for different workers. Increasingly, we have to think about social networks. Social networks because of the enjoyment that a worker can get out of them immediately, but also social networks in terms of developing networks of people with which the worker might be associated for a long time, or which might form the basis of a worker's professional network if they choose to go from one job to another. We have to think about location preference as well. I get some utility out of having a workplace that's fairly near my home if I have a short commute and a very inexpensive commute. Whereas I get a different level of utility, probably a lower level of utility, by having a very similar job, very similar conditions, very similar firm, but it's 50 minutes away. And instead of it costing me $1.50 of gasoline in 5 minutes, maybe it costs me $15 of gasoline and an hour or 50 minutes. And we also have to think about future opportunities as well. I might choose to work for a firm today at maybe a substandard wage because I think there's great opportunity for the future. Maybe that opportunity is expressed in terms of job opportunities in the future, promotion, or maybe the opportunity is expressed in stock options or the ability to work with a innovative firm that's up and coming and that might give me better opportunities in the job market in the future. Well, we can look at these employee considerations in either wage and risk space or wage and benefit space, risks and benefits being the opposite of one another. Let's first think about this in terms of wage and risk space. We're going to think about this with wage on the y-axis and risk on the x-axis. Well, if you think about it, an employee probably would be satisfied with a low wage if they similarly had a low level of risk. So it would give us a point on our curve. And we can also expect that an employee would expect a high level of wage if their job was going to be associated with a higher level of risk. In which case, we see that we're beginning to form some kind of a curve here that takes us through these points. That's a terrible curve, by the way. Let me reformat it. Let me try to reformat it. Well, good grief. There we go. And let's think about it as a indifference curve with a bit of a convex slope to it here. In this case, because we're in wage and risk space, this is an upward sloping curve that we can expect because we don't want risk and we require some additional wage to take on some additional parameter of risk. Well, this would be our indifference curve for this employee, and on an indifference curve, we know that an employee has the same level of satisfaction or utility at any point on the curve. Whether we're here or here or here, it doesn't matter. This employee might have utility level, let's say U1. And if the employee is going to seek a higher level of utility, then maybe they would want to be on a different curve. Maybe they would need to, for this wage and risk space, to get a higher level of utility, they would need to be on curve U2. So for the same level of risk, this employee is receiving a higher level of wage. It's giving them a higher level of utility. Commensurate with that, curve U0, U0, would give a lower level of wage. So for the same, or a lower level of utility rather, for the same level of utility or wage that we had on U1, the same level of wage that we had on U1, this worker receives a higher level of risk. They've gone from R1 to R2. So it's probably giving them some lower level of utility. If we think about it, an indifference curve for a worker, just like an indifference curve for a consumer, is all about the marginal utility that the worker receives from wages and the marginal utility the worker receives from risk. And the indifference curve literally is equal to the marginal utility of risk divided by the marginal utility of wage. Recall that when we're talking about marginal utilities, we're thinking about the additional utility that a worker receives by one more unit or level of risk, or the additional utility benefit satisfaction the worker receives by having one more unit of wage. And in this case, when it's wage and risk space, we have an upward sloping curve. If it was wage and benefit space, which we're often going to think about, the curve will look different. But we might think about how different factors of risk will change our curves here. So maybe we can think of those workers that like risk, those workers that don't like risk, those workers that just absolutely love risk. So let's think about this in wage and risk space again. I'm going to suppose that most workers are relatively risk averse, that they would prefer to have low levels of risk. And if they're very risk averse, then they probably have, I'm going to guess, a fairly steep indifference curve. Let's think about what a steep indifference curve means here. If this is their indifference curve, this would suggest that to take on a little bit more risk, when we go from W1 and R1, to take on just a little bit more risk, is going to require a proportionately higher amount of wage. I didn't really illustrate this very well. So let's kind of come back at this. We'll give our indifference curve here. And to take on, say, a little bit more risk, let's go to R2. Then we're going to see that it requires a much greater change in wage to W2. The difference between R1 and R2 is the difference in risk, but the difference between W1 and W2 is the difference in wage. So a risk-averse worker is going to require a much higher wage as a compensating wage differential as they're taking on some modest level of risk. So we can think about this as the utility of the low risk-averse worker. Well, we can similarly think about the utility of that was the utility of a high risk averse worker. The utility of a low risk averse worker might be much flatter. Maybe we've got a curve that goes along like this. This is for the low risk averse worker, which when we see a flatter curve, it simply means that to take on additional levels of risk, the worker isn't requiring as much of a compensating wage differential because they get some utility out of having some risk. They aren't all that risk averse. They don't mind having some risk. We might also want to think about what does it look like when a worker is risk loving, or sometimes referred to as risk perverse. Well, we might have to think about this in terms of some downward slope instead of an upward slope. This would suggest if someone is actually risk-loving or they get positive utility out of risk. I have a couple of son-in-laws that are like that. They kind of like to live on the edge. They get some satisfaction, some beneficial utility out of having things a little bit more edgy. Maybe they've even got a downward sloping curve. Maybe it looks something like this, where they're willing to accept a lower wage in order to get a higher level of risk because they get a thrill or some satisfaction or benefit out of that. Well, so this is the difference between low risk aversion, high risk aversion, and maybe even risk loving or risk perversion in wage and risk space. Let's think for a moment about wage and benefit space. thinking about wage and benefit has really got the exact same structure, exact same parameters as wage and risk, but since benefit would be the opposite of risk or a negative of risk, then we have a completely differently sloped curve. In this case, we see that this worker in wage and benefit space has an indifference curve that is formed by the marginal utility of the benefit divided by the marginal utility of the wage. And so we see that these are downward sloping, they're concave, and we see that in this case, this worker is just as satisfied at W1, R1 as they are at W2, R2. So in this case, and I should call these B, not R, excuse me. In this case, the worker is willing to give up some wage in order to get some additional utility satisfying benefit. The worker is willing to accept a decrease in wage perhaps to get some utility satisfying benefit. Maybe that's vacation pay, maybe that is future opportunity, maybe it's retirement, maybe it's stock options, maybe it's health insurance, etc. So we're simply looking at these concepts of wage and risk as being worker preferences. And when we think about wage and risk and think about wage and benefit as well, and with respect to worker preference, remember that we're always talking about marginal utilities. Marginal utilities that the worker might receive from some activity. And so the marginal utility of a benefit is probably positive, whereas the marginal utility from some additional level of risk is likely to be negative. And so when we think about the shape and forms of the indifference curves that workers have, we have to consider, is this wage and risk space, in which case we're probably seeing an upward sloping curve in wage and risk space. An upward sloping curve, and constant along that curve is some level of utility. But if we had wage and benefit space, we would be seeing a downward sloping curve. Again, at any point on these curves, the worker has similar levels of utility. The utility level is constant on an indifference curve. This is how we think about compensating wage differentials and employee considerations.